Hey everyone. If you love stories about unexpected connections and moments that completely change your perspective on life, you're in the right place. Today's story is about taking chances, breaking down walls we build around age, and discovering that sometimes the best conversations happen when you least expect them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is David, and I'm 32 years old. Most people know me as the guy who shows up to community events with a guitar case slung over my shoulder and a smile that's probably too big for most situations. I'm a music teacher at Riverside Elementary, but my real passion happens after school hours when I volunteer at the Maplewood Community Center, teaching guitar lessons and helping organize local events. There's something magical about bringing people together through music, watching shy kids find their voice through a song, or seeing adults rediscover the joy they thought they'd lost somewhere between mortgages and middle age. The community center has become my second home over the past 3 years. It's this old brick building that's seen better decades, but somehow that adds to its charm. The floors creak in all the right places. The walls are covered with decades of community photos, and there's always the faint smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, I run what we call Music and More sessions, which started as guitar lessons, but has evolved into something much bigger. We've got everything from beginners learning their first chords to seasoned musicians jamming together. And lately we've been talking about adding dance lessons to the mix. That's where Linda comes into the picture, though I didn't know her name yet when this whole story began. It was a Thursday evening in late September. The kind of autumn night where the air has just enough bite to remind you that summer's over, but isn't quite ready to embrace full winter mode. I was setting up for our evening session, tuning my guitar, and arranging chairs in the community room when I heard laughter echoing from the main hall. Curious, I wandered over to investigate and found myself watching a group of women practicing what looked like a line dance routine. They were clearly having a blast, stumbling through steps and erupting into giggles whenever someone went left instead of right. The whole scene was infectious, the kind of pure joy that makes you want to join in even if you have no idea what you're doing. That's when I spotted her. A woman with shoulder-length brown hair streaked with silver, wearing comfortable jeans and a burgundy sweater that brought out the warmth in her eyes. She was laughing harder than anyone else, not because she was the best dancer, but because she seemed to genuinely not care about being perfect. After watching for a few more minutes, I realized I was probably being creepy, standing there grinning, like an idiot, so I headed back to my guitar session. But throughout the evening, I kept hearing that same infectious laughter drifting through the walls, and I found myself distracted in a way that was both pleasant and completely unexpected. When my session ended around 8:30, I packed up my guitar slowly, hoping to catch another glimpse of the dance group. As I was heading toward the exit, rolling my equipment case behind me, the main hall doors swung open, and out walked the woman in the burgundy sweater, along with 2 other ladies who were still chatting excitedly about their routine. She was fumbling with her car keys, trying to balance a water bottle and what looked like a small purse when the keys slipped from her hands and clattered across the floor. Without thinking, I abandoned my guitar case and rushed over to help, scooping up the keys before they could slide under a nearby bench. As I handed them back to her, our eyes met for the first time. And I felt that strange little flutter you get when you realize someone has a genuinely kind face. Her eyes were hazel with flecks of green, and there were laugh lines around them. That suggested she smiled often and meant it. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice carrying just a hint of breathlessness from the dancing. "I swear these keys have a mind of their own sometimes." "No problem at all," I replied. Then found myself adding, "I couldn't help but notice the dancing earlier. You all looked like you were having an amazing time." She laughed, that same warm sound I'd been hearing through the walls. Amazing might be generous. We're calling it enthusiastic with room for improvement. It's our first time trying line dancing, and let's just say we're better at the enthusiasm part than the coordination part. "Hey, enthusiasm counts for a lot," I said. "I'm David, by the way. I teach guitar lessons here on Tuesdays and Thursdays." "Linda," she said, extending her hand for a shake that was firm and confident. "And guitar lessons sound wonderful. I've always wanted to learn an instrument but convinced myself I was too old to start something new." That comment struck me as odd because Linda didn't look old at all. Sure, she wasn't in her 20s, but there was something youthful and vibrant about her energy that made age seem completely irrelevant. Too old? Come on, some of my best students are in their 50s and 60s. Music doesn't have an expiration date. She tilted her head, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You're very kind, but I'm probably older than your usual students. I found myself grinning, partly because she seemed genuinely surprised by my comment, and partly because I was enjoying this conversation more than I'd enjoyed talking to anyone in months. Well, if you ever decide you want to give it a try, you know where to find me. And hey, if you were 35, I'd probably ask you to skip the guitar lesson and go dancing instead. The words were out of my mouth before I could stop them, meant as a light compliment, a way to acknowledge how graceful she'd looked even while laughing at her own mistakes. But as soon as I said it, I realized how it might sound, like I was suggesting that her current age was somehow a barrier to dancing or fun or anything else. Linda's expression shifted, and for a moment I thought I'd offended her. But then she smiled, not the polite smile you give to deflect awkwardness, but something more genuine and maybe a little mischievous. Well, she said, her voice carrying a playful challenge. I'm actually 48. Is that too old? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized this was one of those moments that could go several different ways. I could laugh it off, make some joke about age being just a number, and we'd both walk away having shared a pleasant but forgettable conversation. Or I could lean into the honesty of the moment and see where it led. 48? I repeated, as if I was considering this new information very seriously. That's a tough one. I mean, do your knees still work? Can you handle staying up past 9 o'clock? Because dancing is serious business. Linda burst out laughing, the kind of delighted surprise that told me she hadn't expected me to play along. My knees are in excellent working order, thank you. Very much. And I'll have you know I regularly stay up until at least 9:30 on weekends. 9:30? Wow. We've got a real night owl here, I teased. In that case, I think we could probably manage a dance or two, though I should warn you, my dancing skills are about on par with your line dancing, which is to say, enthusiastic with significant room for improvement. The conversation was taking on a momentum of its own, and I found myself genuinely curious about this woman who could laugh at herself while line dancing and then meet my awkward compliment with such graceful humor. There was something refreshing about talking to someone who didn't seem to be trying to impress anyone, who was comfortable enough in her own skin to acknowledge her age without either apologizing for it or wearing it like armor. You know what? Linda said, checking her phone for the time. I might just take you up on that dance offer. The community center is hosting a fall mixer next Friday night, and I was planning to go anyway. They're supposed to have live music and actual dancing, not just our amateur line dancing attempts. Really? I asked, surprised by how pleased I was by this turn of events. I mean, yes, absolutely. I'll be there anyway since I'm helping with the music setup, but I'd love to save a dance for you. Or several dances, depending on how those knees hold up. Linda grinned and pulled a pen from her purse, reaching for my hand. For a second, I thought she was going to write her phone number on my palm like we were teenagers, but instead she just pretended to examine my fingers very seriously. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. These look like capable dancing hands, she pronounced solemnly. I think they'll do nicely. As we said goodbye and headed to our respective cars, I found myself replaying the entire conversation in my head. There was something about Linda that was completely different from anyone I'd met recently. She had this way of being present in the moment, of treating our chance encounter like it was worth her full attention rather than just polite small talk while she waited to leave. Driving home through the quiet streets of Maplewood, I realized I was looking forward to Friday night in a way I hadn't looked forward to anything in months. It wasn't just about the dancing, though I was genuinely curious to see how that would go. It was more about the possibility of continuing a conversation with someone who seemed to understand that the best parts of life often happen when you're not taking yourself too seriously. The community center mixer had been on my calendar for weeks, just another event where I'd help set up the sound system, maybe play a few songs, and then probably end up in the corner talking shop with other musicians. but now it felt like something worth anticipating. A chance to see if the easy chemistry Linda and I had stumbled into could survive in a different setting. As I pulled into my driveway, I caught myself wondering what Linda was thinking about our conversation. Did she see it as harmless flirting with the younger guy from the community center? Or was she as intrigued by our unexpected connection as I was? 48 wasn't old, not by any reasonable standard. But I knew enough about social expectations to understand that some people might see our age difference as significant. The funny thing was, during our entire conversation, Linda's age had felt completely irrelevant. She had an energy and curiosity that seemed much more important than whatever number appeared on her driver's license. If anything, there was something appealing about talking to someone who had enough life experience to know who she was and what she wanted. Someone who wasn't still figuring out the basics of being an adult. That night, as I got ready for bed, I found myself thinking about the question Linda had asked. Is that too old? It was such a simple question, but it revealed so much about the assumptions we all carry about age and attraction, and what's supposed to be appropriate at different stages of life. The truth was, I didn't know if 48 was too old, because I'd never really thought about it before. What I did know was that I'd rather spend an evening dancing with someone who could make me laugh and feel genuinely engaged than with someone half her age who left me checking my phone every 10 minutes. Friday couldn't come fast enough, but when it finally arrived, I found myself second-guessing everything about the evening ahead. Standing in front of my bedroom mirror, I'd already changed shirts 3 times, trying to find the right balance. Between looking like I'd made an effort without appearing like I was trying too hard. The community center mixer was supposed to be casual. But Linda would be there, and suddenly casual felt loaded with possibilities I hadn't fully considered. I settled on a navy button-down with the sleeves rolled up, and my best pair of dark jeans, the ones that didn't have paint stains from last weekend's apartment touch-up project. As I grabbed my keys and headed out, I realized my palms were actually sweating. When was the last time I'd been nervous about seeing someone? College, maybe? This was ridiculous. It was just dancing with a neighbor I'd met once, not a marriage proposal. The community center was already buzzing with activity when I arrived at 6 to help with the setup. Margaret, the volunteer coordinator who'd been running events here since before I was born, greeted me with her usual no-nonsense efficiency. She was one of those people who could organize a town festival with one hand tied behind her back and still have time to lecture you about not putting the microphones away properly. "David, thank goodness you're here," she said, clipboard in, hand and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "The band is running late, something about a flat tire, and we need to get the sound system tested before people start arriving. Also, the tables for the refreshments need to be moved, and somebody forgot to bring the extension cords for the lights." I loved Margaret's ability to present 17 problems at once while somehow making it sound like everything was completely under control. "No worries. I've got extension cords in my car, and I can handle the sound check. What time does everything officially start?" 7:30, but you know how these things go. People will start trickling in around 7, and by 8 we'll have half the town here complaining about the music being too loud or not loud enough. She paused and gave me a curious look. "You seem unusually cheerful tonight. Usually you're grumbling about having to deal with the ancient sound system." Margaret had known me long enough to read my moods with embarrassing accuracy. "Just looking forward to the evening," I said, hoping I sounded casual. "It'll be nice to see everyone having fun instead of sitting in a circle trying to tune guitars." She raised an eyebrow but didn't push further, which I appreciated. Margaret had a gift for knowing when to probe and when to let things be. We spent the next hour getting everything ready, and I found myself checking the door every few minutes, wondering when Linda would arrive and whether she'd actually show up at all. Maybe our conversation had seemed more significant to me than it had to her. Maybe she'd thought it over and decided that dancing with someone 14 years younger wasn't worth the potential awkwardness. By 7:15, the main hall was transformed. The harsh fluorescent lights had been replaced with warmer lighting from the portable lamps we'd borrowed from the theater group. Tables lined the walls with an impressive spread of homemade treats that appeared whenever Maplewood residents got together for anything. The makeshift dance floor in the center of the room was already drawing curious looks from the early arrivals, mostly the same faces I saw at every community event, plus a few I didn't recognize. I was adjusting the microphone height on the small stage when I heard a familiar laugh near the entrance. My head snapped up so quickly I nearly knocked over the mic stand. And there was Linda, talking to Margaret and gesturing towards something I couldn't see. She was wearing a forest green dress that hit just below her knees, and looked both elegant and comfortable, paired with low heels that suggested she'd actually come prepared to dance. What struck me most, though, was how she seemed to light up the space around her. Even from across the room I could see that Margaret was already charmed, laughing at something Linda had said and nodding enthusiastically. This was Linda's superpower, I realized. She had this way of making people feel like they were part of something special, just by being genuinely interested in what they had to say. I finished with the sound system and made my way over, arriving just as Margaret was explaining the evening's schedule. "David handles all our music events," Margaret was saying. "He's the one who convinced us to finally upgrade from that terrible old stereo system we'd been using since the Clinton administration." Linda turned as I approached, and her face lit up with a smile that made my earlier nervousness seem completely silly. "David, I was hoping you'd be here early. Margaret was just telling me about all the work you do for the community center. I had no idea you were practically running the place." "Hardly running it," I said, shooting Margaret a look. "I just show up and try not to break anything expensive." Margaret snorted. "Don't let him fool you, Linda. This place would fall apart without him. Last month he spent his entire Saturday fixing the piano in the children's room because he couldn't stand hearing it out of tune." "A well-tuned piano is important," I protested, feeling slightly embarrassed by Margaret's praise. "Kids deserve to hear music the way it's supposed to sound." Linda's expression softened in a way that made me think she understood something about that sentiment that went beyond just tuning instruments. "That's really lovely," she said simply, and somehow those 3 words carried more weight than all of Margaret's elaborate compliments. The band arrived shortly after, 3 guys in their 50s who called themselves the Riverside Revival, and played a mix of classic rock, country, and what they generously referred to as dance favorites. They were good enough to keep people entertained and not so polished that they made everyone else feel inadequate. Perfect for a community center mixer where the goal was fun, rather than musical perfection. As more people filtered in, I found myself introducing Linda to the regulars. There was Bob, the retired mechanic who never missed a community event and always had a story about the good old days that was somehow both nostalgic and hilarious. There was Carol, who ran the local flower shop and treated every social gathering like a chance to catch up on 6 months of neighborhood gossip. And there was Father Miguel from St. Mary's, who, despite being in his 70s, could outdance most people half his age. What impressed me was how easily Linda fit into these conversations. She wasn't trying to prove anything or win anyone over, just genuinely engaging with whatever topic came up. When Bob started telling a story about the time he accidentally painted his garage door the wrong color, Linda listened like it was the most fascinating thing she'd ever heard. When Carol mentioned struggling to keep up with social media for her business, Linda offered practical suggestions without being condescending. The evening really started when the Riverside Revival launched into their first set. They opened with Sweet Caroline, which immediately got half the room singing along, and I watched Linda's face light up as the energy in the room shifted. There's something magical about live music in a small space, the way it creates an instant sense of community even among strangers. "So," I said, leaning close enough to be heard over the music, "ready for that dance?" Linda grinned and held out her hand. "I thought you'd never ask." The first song we danced to was Can't Help Myself by the Four Tops, which was perfect because it was upbeat enough to be fun but not so fast that we had to worry about complicated steps. Linda moved with a natural rhythm that suggested she'd done plenty of dancing in her life, even if line dancing was new territory. She wasn't showy about it, just comfortable in her own skin and willing to follow where the music led. "You're a much better dancer than you claimed," I said as we spun, through a simple turn. "You're not so bad yourself," she replied, though I should probably mention that I may have downplayed my experience a little. I took dance lessons in college, and my ex-husband and I used to go dancing fairly regularly before. She trailed off, and I could see her debating whether to finish that thought. I'd learned enough about people to know when someone was editing themselves in real time, usually because they were worried about sharing too much too soon. "Before life got complicated?" I suggested gently. Linda nodded, looking grateful that I'd given her an out. "Something like that. It's funny how you can forget about the things you used to love doing when you're focused on just getting through each day. I understood that feeling more than I wanted to admit. Over the past few years, I'd watched too many people my age get so caught up in career goals and relationship drama that they forgot how to just enjoy themselves. Linda was talking about a different kind of life complexity, but the results seemed similar. Somewhere along the way, dancing had moved from something she loved to something she used to do. The song ended, and the Riverside revival transitioned into The Way You Look Tonight, which was slower and infinitely more dangerous territory. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if a slow dance might be pushing things too fast, but Linda stepped closer and placed her hand on my shoulder, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Dancing slowly with someone is a completely different experience than dancing fast. There's nowhere to hide behind fancy footwork or energetic movements. It's just two people moving together, close enough to feel each other's breathing, close enough to notice small details like the faint scent of lavender perfume, or the way someone's eyes crinkle slightly when they smile. Linda was a few inches shorter than me, which meant I had to look down slightly to meet her eyes, and she had to tilt her head up. It created this intimate little bubble around us, even though we were surrounded by other couples swaying to the same music. I became hyper-aware of everything. The warmth of her hand in mine, the way she moved with complete confidence despite claiming to be out of practice, the fact that she wasn't checking over my shoulder to see who else was watching. "Can I ask you something?" she said, after we'd been dancing for a few minutes. "Of course. When you made that comment about dancing with me if I were 35, what were you thinking? I mean, was that just something you say to be nice? Or were you actually trying to ask me out in the most roundabout way possible?" Her directness caught me off guard, but I appreciated it. Linda wasn't the type to let things stay ambiguous when she could just ask for clarification. "Honestly, I think I was trying to compliment you without really thinking about what I was saying. But then when you asked if 48 was too old, it made me realize I'd never actually considered whether age should matter for something like dancing, or anything else, really." "And what conclusion did you reach?" "I thought about it while we swayed through another verse of the song, that I'd rather dance with someone who makes me laugh and feel engaged than with someone who's supposedly the right age, but leaves me bored out of my mind. Age is just information. What you do with your life, how you treat people, whether you still get excited about new experiences, that seems more important." Linda smiled, but it was a thoughtful expression rather than just pleased. "That's a nice answer. Very diplomatic." "But," I could hear the unfinished thought in her voice, "but you haven't had to deal with what it's like to be judged for your age yet. When you're a woman over 40, people make a lot of assumptions about what you should want, how you should act, whether you're still relevant. It changes how you move through the world." I nodded, recognizing that she was sharing something important. "I imagine it does. I'm sorry people make it complicated." "It's not your fault," Linda said quickly. "I just want you to understand that when I asked if 48 was too old, I wasn't fishing for compliments. I was genuinely curious about whether you'd thought through what it might mean to be interested in someone my age." The song was winding down, but neither of us had stepped apart yet. "And what does it mean?" I asked. "It means I come with a full life already in progress. I have a daughter who's probably going to be skeptical of anyone I date. I have a mortgage and a retirement plan, and strong opinions about things you might not have considered yet. I'm not a blank slate." "Good," I said, surprising both of us with the immediacy of my response. Blank slates are overrated. I'd much rather get to know someone who's already figured out who she is than try to navigate a relationship with someone who's still in the experimental phase of adulthood. Linda laughed, shaking her head. "You might change your mind when you meet Jessica and she gives you the third degree about your intentions." "Jessica's your daughter?" 26 years old and extremely protective of her mother's well-being. She's going to want to know everything about you, starting with why someone your age is interested in someone mine." The song ended, and we finally stepped apart, though Linda kept hold of my hand as we walked back toward the refreshment table. "Well," I said, "when that conversation happens, I'll just tell her the truth, that I met this incredible woman who made me laugh within 5 minutes of knowing her, who was brave enough to try line dancing even though she knew she'd probably look ridiculous, and who asked me honest questions instead of just assuming she knew what I was thinking. Linda stopped walking and turned to face me fully. "David, are you always this charming, or are you just having a really good night?" "I think I'm having a really good night," I admitted, "but I'm also just saying what I actually think. I don't see the point in playing games or trying to be something I'm not." She studied my face for a moment, as if trying to determine whether I was being genuine or just very good at saying the right things. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because her expression relaxed into something warm and open. "In that case," she said, "I think I'd like to keep dancing with you, but I should probably warn you that Bob is heading this way with what looks like a very determined expression, and I suspect he's about to ask me to dance. Bob is sweet, but he has a tendency to step on toes." I looked over to see Bob approaching, with the careful gait of someone who'd already had a beer or two and was feeling sociable. "Want me to run interference?" I asked. "Actually," Linda said with a mischievous grin, "I think I can handle Bob. But save the next slow song for me?" "Absolutely." As Bob reached us and launched into an elaborate request for a dance that included a detailed explanation of his improved footwork since last year's mixer, I watched Linda graciously accept while somehow making it clear that she was only committing to one song. She had this diplomatic skill that I envied, the ability to be kind and firm at the same time. While Linda navigated the dance floor with Bob, I found myself talking to Father Miguel, who had been watching our earlier conversation, with the amused expression of someone who'd seen plenty of romance bloom at community events over the years. "She seems lovely," he said without preamble. "Linda? Yes, she really is. And you seem smitten." I laughed, not bothering to deny it. Father Miguel was impossible to fool, and besides, I was beginning to realize that trying to downplay my interest in Linda felt dishonest. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's been watching people fall for each other for 40 years, he said kindly. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before I could answer, the band started playing At Last by Etta James, and I looked across the room to catch Linda's eye. She was just finishing her dance with Bob, who was already scanning the room for his next partner. Linda walked back toward me with a smile that suggested she'd been thinking about our conversation while dancing with someone else. "I believe you promised me this one," she said. "I did indeed." This time there was no hesitation as we moved together. Linda fit perfectly in my arms, and we fell into an easy rhythm that felt like we'd been dancing together for years rather than hours. The community center faded into background noise as we found our own small space in the music. "So," Linda said softly, "what happens after tonight?" It was the question I'd been wondering about all evening, but hearing her ask it directly made me realize I'd already decided on my answer. "I'd like to take you to dinner, somewhere with actual cloth napkins and a wine list, where we can talk without having to shout over a band." "That sounds wonderful," she said. "But I should probably mention that Jessica is going to want to meet you first. She has this theory that anyone I date should have to pass inspection before things get too serious." "How serious is dinner?" Linda considered this. "Serious enough that she'll want to know your last name and whether you have any outstanding warrants." "Well, I can definitely provide my last name, and my criminal record is embarrassingly clean. Think that'll be enough to pass the initial screening?" "We'll find out," Linda said with a laugh. "Fair warning, though, Jessica inherited my stubborn streak and my ability to ask uncomfortable questions. She's not going to take it easy on you, just because you're charming." "Good to know," I said. I'd rather deal with honest skepticism than fake politeness anyway. As the song wound down, I realized that what had started as an impulsive comment about dancing had somehow evolved into the beginning of something real. Linda wasn't just someone I'd met at a community event, someone to pass time with for an evening. She was someone I wanted to get to know properly, someone whose opinions and stories and terrible line dancing attempts I wanted to be part of my regular life. The evening continued with more dancing, more conversations with neighbors, and more moments where Linda and I found ourselves drawn back to each other, despite the social obligations of a community mixer. By the time the Riverside Revival played their final song and people started gathering their coats and saying goodbyes, I felt like the entire world had shifted slightly on its axis. Linda and I walked out to the parking lot together, the cool October air a sharp contrast to the warmth of the community center. Most of the other cars had already left, leaving just a few scattered vehicles under the parking lot lights. "So," she said as we reached her car, "dinner sometime this week?" "How about Wednesday? There's a place called Rosewood about 20 minutes from here that I've been wanting to try." "Perfect. Should I meet you there or—" "I'll pick you up," I said. 7 o'clock? Linda smiled and pulled out her phone. "I should probably give you my number then. And my address. Jessica would be mortified if I let a strange man pick me up without proper coordination." As we exchanged contact information, I found myself thinking about how different this felt from other dating situations I'd been in recently. There was something refreshingly straightforward about the whole thing. Linda wasn't playing hard to get or pretending to be less interested than she was. She was just being herself, honest and direct, and willing to see where things might lead. "David," she said as she got into her car, "thanks for a wonderful evening. I haven't had that much fun in a long time. Thank you for saying yes to dancing with someone who's apparently too young to know better." Linda laughed as she started her car. "We'll see about that. Good night, David." As I watched her drive away, I realized I was already looking forward to Wednesday with an anticipation that felt both exciting and slightly terrifying. Linda had made it clear that getting involved with her meant getting involved with her whole life, including a protective daughter and probably a dozen other complications I hadn't considered yet. But as I drove home through the quiet streets of Maplewood, I couldn't bring myself to see any of that as a problem. For the first time in months, maybe years, I was looking forward to something that felt genuinely meaningful. And if that meant navigating the complexities of dating someone who'd already lived enough life to know exactly who she was and what she wanted, then that seemed like a pretty good problem to have. Wednesday couldn't arrive fast enough, but when it did, I discovered that anticipating a date and actually preparing for one were two entirely different challenges. I'd been thinking about dinner with Linda all week, replaying conversations from the mixer, and imagining what we might talk about when we had more than stolen moments between dances. What I hadn't considered was the practical reality of getting ready for a dinner that felt more significant than any I'd had in recent memory. Standing in my closet at 5:30, I was facing the same shirt crisis I'd experienced before the mixer. Only this time, the stakes felt higher. Rosewood was nice enough to require actual effort, but not so fancy that I'd look ridiculous if I overdressed. I finally settled on a gray sweater that my sister had insisted made me look sophisticated, paired with dark slacks that I'd only worn twice since buying them. As I drove toward Linda's address, which turned out to be in a quiet residential neighborhood about 10 minutes from the community center, I found myself rehearsing conversation topics like I was preparing for a job interview. What if we ran out of things to talk about? What if the easy chemistry we'd found while dancing didn't translate to sitting across from each other at a restaurant table? What if meeting Jessica went terribly, and Linda decided I wasn't worth the family drama? Linda's house was a charming 2-story colonial, with a front porch that suggested someone who cared about creating a welcoming space. The lawn was meticulously maintained, and there were pots of fall flowers flanking the front door that looked like they'd been arranged by someone with an actual eye for color and design. I was admiring the attention to detail when the front door opened before I could even ring the bell. "Right on time," Linda said, stepping out onto the porch. She was wearing a navy dress with a cardigan that brought out the blue in her eyes, and she looked simultaneously elegant and comfortable, in a way that made me grateful I'd put effort into my own appearance. "You look beautiful," I said, meaning it completely. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself." She paused, glancing back toward the house. "Fair warning, Jessica is inside and she's been pacing around the kitchen for the past hour like she's preparing for a cross-examination. She made me promise to text her when we get to the restaurant and when we're leaving." "Should I be worried?" Linda grinned. "Probably. But she's more bark than bite, and she wants me to be happy. She's just not entirely convinced that dating someone younger is the path to happiness." As if summoned by our conversation, a young woman appeared in the doorway. Jessica had Linda's eyes but darker hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she was wearing scrubs that suggested she'd just gotten home from work. She looked tired but alert in the way that told me she was definitely planning to evaluate my worthiness as a dinner companion for her mother. "You must be David," Jessica said, stepping onto the porch with the confidence of someone who was used to taking charge of situations. "I'm Jessica." "Nice to meet you," I said, extending my hand for what turned out to be a surprisingly firm handshake. "Linda's told me a lot about you." "I'm sure she has," Jessica replied with a slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "She tells me you're a music teacher." "Elementary school, and I volunteer at the community center. Your mom probably mentioned I help with events there." Jessica nodded, clearly working through some internal checklist. "And you're 32? "I am. Mom's 48. She mentioned that." There was a moment of silence where Jessica seemed to be waiting for me to say something else. Maybe to acknowledge the age difference or explain my intentions or provide some kind of reassurance about my character. Instead, I just waited, figuring that whatever test this was, being defensive probably wasn't the right approach. Finally, Jessica's expression softened slightly. "She's been looking forward to tonight all week. That's not something that happens very often." "I've been looking forward to it too," I said honestly. "Good." Jessica turned to her mother. "Have fun, but not too much fun. And remember what we talked about." Linda rolled her eyes affectionately. "Yes, dear. Text when we arrive. Text when we leave. Don't do anything you wouldn't do." "I wouldn't do a lot of things," Jessica said dryly. "That's not a very restrictive guideline." I laughed before I could stop myself, earning a surprised look from Jessica and a grin from Linda. "Sorry," I said, "but that was actually pretty funny." Jessica studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod that felt like grudging approval. "Okay, you can take her to dinner, but I expect her home at a reasonable hour." "Jessica," Linda protested. "I'm not 16. No. But you're my mother, which means I reserve the right to worry about you regardless of your age." As we walked to my car, Linda shook her head with a mixture of embarrassment and affection. "I'm sorry about that. She means well, but she's been protective ever since the divorce. Sometimes, I think she forgets that I managed to function as an adult for 26 years before she was born." "She seems like she cares about you a lot," I said, opening the passenger door for Linda. "That's not a bad problem to have." "Most of the time I agree with you. Tonight I was hoping she'd be a little less thorough in her background check." The drive to Rosewood gave us a chance to settle into conversation without the pressure of a formal dinner setting. Linda asked about my teaching, and I found myself telling her stories about my students that I usually only shared with other teachers. There was something about her genuine interest that made me want to explain not just what I did, but why I loved doing it. "There's this kid in my 4th grade class, Marcus," I said as we pulled into the restaurant parking lot. "He's been struggling with reading, and his parents were worried he might have some kind of learning disability. But last month, I noticed him humming along perfectly to songs we played during our music time, remembering lyrics to complex verses. So I started incorporating more musical elements into his reading lessons, and suddenly, he's improving dramatically." "That's wonderful," Linda said. "It sounds like you really see your students as individuals rather than just names on a roster." "I try to. Kids are so much more capable than adults usually give them credit for. They just need someone to pay attention to what actually works for them, instead of insisting they fit into predetermined boxes." Rosewood turned out to be exactly what I'd hoped for, cozy enough to feel intimate but not so romantic that it would create pressure. We were seated at a corner table with soft lighting and enough space to talk without feeling like we were performing for the other diners. The menu was interesting without being pretentious, and our server was attentive without being intrusive. "So," Linda said after we'd ordered wine and appetizers, "tell me about your family. Do you have siblings? Are your parents still around?" "One sister, Emma, who's 2 years older and works as a nurse in Chicago. My parents are both retired and living in Florida, where they've become the kind of people who know every server at every restaurant within a 20-mile radius of their condo." "That sounds lovely, actually. Do you see them often?" "A few times a year. Emma and I try to coordinate visits so we can all be together." "What about you? I know you have Jessica, but what about the rest of your family?" Linda's expression shifted slightly, taking on the careful quality I'd noticed when she'd mentioned her ex-husband at the mixer. "My parents both died within 2 years of each other when Jessica was in high school. That was actually part of what led to my divorce. My ex-husband thought I was spending too much time dealing with family obligations and not enough time focusing on our marriage. I'm sorry, I said. That must have been incredibly difficult. It was, but it also taught me something important about the kind of person I want in my life. When things get complicated, which they inevitably do, I need someone who's going to step up and help rather than someone who's going to resent the inconvenience. I nodded, understanding that this wasn't just casual conversation. Linda was telling me something important about her expectations and her experiences, giving me information that would help me understand what kind of relationship she was looking for. How long have you been divorced? I asked. 3 years. The marriage had been over emotionally for longer than that, but it took time to work through all the practical details. Jessica was finishing college, and I wanted to make sure the transition didn't disrupt her life more than necessary. That was thoughtful of you. Linda smiled, but there was something sad in it. Maybe. Or maybe I was just avoiding having to figure out who I was as a single person again. It's strange, building a life with someone, and then suddenly having to remember what you actually want when you're not trying to compromise with someone else's preferences. What have you discovered? That I like my house quieter than he did, but I miss having someone to cook for. That I enjoy having control over the television remote, but I don't enjoy eating dinner alone every night. That I'm more social than I thought I was, but I'm also more selective about the people I want to spend time with. Our appetizers arrived, giving us a natural pause in the conversation. I found myself thinking about what Linda had just shared, the honesty of admitting that single life was both better and worse than married life had been. There was something refreshing about talking to someone who didn't feel the need to present their life as perfect or completely figured out. Can I ask what made you decide to try dating again? I said. You mean besides meeting a charming music teacher who asked me to dance? Linda grinned, then grew more serious. Honestly, I wasn't sure I was ready. But Jessica started graduate school this fall, and suddenly I had all this time and energy that I'd been pouring into parenting. I realized I could either figure out how to build a life that was fulfilling on its own terms, or I could spend the next 20 years feeling sorry for myself. And line dancing was part of figuring out a fulfilling life? Line dancing was my compromise with my friend Carol, who's been trying to get me to join her book club for months. I told her I'd try one new social activity if she'd stop leaving romance novels on my doorstep with sticky notes about how I needed to get back out there. I laughed. Carol sounds like a good friend. She is. She's also relentless when she decides you need help, whether you've asked for it or not. The line dancing was supposed to be a one-time thing to get her off my back, but I actually enjoyed it. It felt good to be terrible at something without worrying about what anyone else thought. Is that unusual for you? Linda considered this, while sampling the bruschetta we were sharing. I spent a lot of years being careful about how I appeared to other people. When you're married to someone who's very concerned about image and social standing, you get into the habit of editing yourself. It's liberating to realize that I can try new things and fail at them without it reflecting on anyone else. Our entrees arrived, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics, but I found myself thinking about what Linda had said about editing herself. I'd met people like her ex-husband, individuals who were so worried about maintaining a certain appearance that they made everyone around them feel like they had to be perfect all the time. It explained a lot about Linda's refreshing directness and her apparent comfort with being genuinely herself. Tell me about your students, Linda said as we worked through our main courses. What's the most rewarding part of teaching? Probably those moments when you see a kid suddenly understand something they've been struggling with. There's this light that comes into their eyes when a concept finally clicks, and it's like watching someone discover they're capable of more than they thought they were. That sounds similar to what I do, actually. I'm a physical therapist, and a lot of my work is helping people rediscover what their bodies can do after an injury or illness. There's something powerful about watching someone realize they're not as limited as they feared. How did you get into physical therapy? Originally, I wanted to be a dancer, Linda said with a self-deprecating smile. I was actually pretty good in college, but I was realistic about the odds of making a career out of it. Physical therapy felt like a way to stay connected to movement and the human body, while also having job security. Do you ever regret not pursuing dance professionally? Linda paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. I used to think I did. But now I wonder if I would have loved it as much if it had been my job instead of something I did for joy. There's something to be said for keeping some things just for yourself. Is that why you seemed so happy at the line dancing class? Because it was just for fun? Partly, but also because I was doing it with other women who were there for the same reason. Just to try something new and laugh at ourselves. There was no pressure to be good at it, or to impress anyone. I thought about this as I finished my salmon. There was something appealing about Linda's approach to trying new things. The idea that not everything had to be productive or goal-oriented. It reminded me of why I'd started volunteering at the community center in the first place, not to advance my career or build my resume, but simply because I enjoyed bringing people together through music. What about you? Linda asked. Do you have hobbies outside of music and teaching? I used to think music was my hobby, before it became my job. Now I'm trying to figure out what I do just for myself. I've been thinking about taking up hiking, maybe photography, something that gets me outside and doesn't involve lesson plans or chord progressions. That sounds wonderful. I've been wanting to try hiking too, actually. Jessica keeps sending me articles about the benefits of outdoor exercise for women over 40, which I choose to interpret as encouragement rather than commentary on my current fitness level. Maybe we could try it together sometime, I suggested, then immediately worried that I was moving too fast. I mean, if this goes well and we decide we want to see each other again, Linda smiled. I'd like that. And yes, I'm definitely hoping this goes well enough for a second date. The relief I felt at her words was probably disproportionate to the situation, but I couldn't help grinning. Good. Because I'm having a really great time, and I was starting to worry that I was the only one. Trust me, you're not. This is the best conversation I've had in months. We lingered over dessert, neither of us seeming eager to end the evening. The restaurant had filled up around us, but I'd barely noticed other diners. Linda had this quality of making me feel like whatever we were talking about was the most interesting topic in the world, whether we were discussing teaching methods, or her physical therapy patients, or the relative merits of different hiking trails. When we finally asked for the check, I realized we'd been talking for nearly 3 hours. It felt like 30 minutes. I should probably get you home, I said, reluctantly. I don't want Jessica to think I've kidnapped you. She's probably watching the clock right now, Linda agreed, but I'm glad we didn't rush through dinner. I was worried we might run out of things to talk about. I was worried about the same thing, I admitted. Turns out that wasn't a problem. As we drove back toward Linda's house, I found myself already thinking about when we might see each other again. The evening had exceeded every expectation I'd had, and I was beginning to understand why Linda had been cautious about dating again. When you find someone you genuinely connect with, someone who makes you laugh and think and want to share more of yourself, the stakes suddenly feel much higher. David, Linda said as we pulled into her driveway, I want you to know that tonight was exactly what I hoped it would be. You're easy to talk to, and you actually listen to what I'm saying instead of just waiting for your turn to speak. That's because what you're saying is interesting, I replied. I want to hear your thoughts about things. That's not as common as you might think. We sat in the car for a moment, neither of us moving to get out. I could see a light on in what I assumed was the living room window, and I suspected Jessica was probably waiting to hear how the evening had gone. So, I said, when can I see you again? How about this weekend? There's a farmer's market on Saturday morning that I've been meaning to check out. We could walk around, get coffee, see if we can find some good apples for hiking snacks. That sounds perfect, I said. Should I pick you up, or would you prefer to meet there? Pick me up. Jessica will want to conduct another inspection anyway, and it's easier to get it over with than to try to avoid it. I walked Linda to her front door, and we stood on the porch for a moment in that slightly awkward space where you're not sure whether to shake hands, hug, or attempt a goodnight kiss. Linda solved the dilemma by stepping closer and giving me a warm hug that lasted just long enough to suggest she'd enjoyed the evening as much as I had. Thank you for a wonderful night, she said softly. Thank you for saying yes to dinner with someone who's apparently too young to know better. Linda laughed. We'll see about that. Good night, David. As I drove home, I found myself thinking about the evening in a way that was both satisfied and anticipatory. Dinner with Linda had been everything I'd hoped for and more. She was intelligent, funny, honest about her life and her experiences, and completely comfortable with who she was. The age difference that had seemed like a potential complication now felt irrelevant compared to how well we connected. But I also understood that tonight had been the easy part. We'd had a lovely dinner in a neutral location, talking about safe topics and enjoying each other's company. The real test would come as we started integrating into each other's actual lives, meeting friends and family, navigating the practical realities of dating someone who was in a different stage of life than I was. As I pulled into my apartment complex, my phone buzzed with a text from Linda. "Home safe. Jessica approved of my choice in dinner companions. Thank you again for a lovely evening." I replied immediately. "Looking forward to Saturday. Sleep well." As I got ready for bed, I realized I was already mentally planning our farmer's market visit, thinking about which vendors might have the best coffee and what kinds of apples would be best for hiking. For the first time in months, I was looking forward to the weekend with genuine excitement rather than just relief that the work week was over. Linda had asked me earlier if I'd thought through what it meant to be interested in someone her age. At the time, I'd given what I thought was a good answer about preferring someone who already knew who she was. But now, lying in bed and thinking about our evening together, I realized I was beginning to understand what she'd really been asking. Dating Linda meant dating someone who had already lived through marriage and divorce, who had raised a daughter and buried her parents, who had built a career and a life that existed completely independently of me. It meant being with someone who didn't need me to complete her, but might choose to include me in something that was already whole. That should have been intimidating, but instead, it felt like the most appealing challenge I'd encountered in years. Linda wasn't looking for someone to rescue her or fix her or provide her with an identity. She was looking for someone to share adventures with, someone who could appreciate what she'd already accomplished while being excited about what came next. As I drifted off to sleep, I found myself thinking about Saturday morning and farmer's market coffee, and the possibility that this thing between Linda and me might actually be the beginning of something real and lasting, and completely worth whatever complications came with it. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that made everything feel possible. I'd woken up earlier than usual, not because I'd set an alarm, but because I'd been looking forward to the farmer's market with Linda all week. There's something about anticipating time with someone you're genuinely excited to see that makes sleep feel optional. I was supposed to pick Linda up at 9, which gave me plenty of time to overthink my outfit choice and wonder whether bringing flowers was too much for a casual farmer's market visit. I finally decided against the flowers, figuring that Linda seemed like someone who appreciated gestures that felt natural rather than calculated. Linda's neighborhood looked different in the morning light, more welcoming somehow. The trees lining her street were showing off their fall colors, and there was that particular quality of weekend morning quiet that suggested people were taking their time getting started with the day. When I knocked on her door, it opened almost immediately, like she'd been watching for my car. "Perfect timing," she said, stepping out with a canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder. She was wearing jeans and a rust-colored sweater that made her hair look even more vibrant. And she had the relaxed energy of someone who was genuinely looking forward to spending the morning wandering around, looking at vegetables and homemade crafts. "No Jessica inspection this time?" I asked as we walked to my car. "She's at her boyfriend's place," Linda said with a grin. "But don't think that means you're off the hook. She left me a list of questions I'm supposed to ask you. Such as whether you have any hidden addictions, what your long-term career goals are, and if you've ever been arrested for anything more serious than a parking ticket." I laughed as I opened the car door for her. "Well, I can honestly say no to addiction and arrest records. Career goals might take longer to explain." The farmer's market was held in the parking lot of the old Riverside courthouse, and it was already bustling with activity when we arrived. There were maybe 30 vendors set up with everything from fresh produce to handmade soaps, to a booth selling what appeared to be artisanal dog treats. The whole scene had that small-town community feel that I'd grown to love about Maplewood, where running errands turned into social events. Linda immediately gravitated toward a booth selling apple cider donuts, and I watched her chat with the vendor like they were old friends. It turned out they weren't, but Linda had this gift for making people feel comfortable enough to share stories about their businesses, their families, their opinions on whether this year's apple crop was better than last year's. "You're really good at that," I said, as we walked away with a bag of warm donuts and 2 cups of cider. Good at what? Talking to people. Making them feel like you're genuinely interested in what they have to say. Linda paused, considering. This. I suppose it's because I usually am genuinely interested. Most people have fascinating stories if you give them a chance to tell them. We wandered through the market, sampling honey and looking at handmade pottery and debating the merits of different varieties of winter squash. Linda approached each booth with the same curiosity she'd shown with the donut vendor, asking questions. That went beyond just price and availability. She wanted to know how long the ceramics artist had been working, whether the honey came from local hives, if the farmer had tried growing any new vegetables this year. At the flower booth, Linda stopped to admire a display of fall mums in deep purples and golds. The vendor, an older woman with soil under her fingernails and the kind of tan that comes from spending entire days outdoors, lit up when Linda asked about the growing season. "These beauties have been my pride and joy this year," the woman said, gesturing toward the mums. "Started them from cuttings back in June, and look how they turned out." "They're gorgeous," Linda said, and I could tell she meant it. "I've been thinking about adding some fall color to my front porch." "You should take some home then. A woman needs flowers around her to remind her she's worth beautiful things." Linda looked surprised by the comment, then smiled in a way that made me think the flower vendor had touched on something important. "You know what? You're absolutely right." As Linda selected several pots of mums, I found myself thinking about what the vendor had said. There was something in Linda's reaction that suggested she'd needed to hear those words, that maybe she'd spent some time forgetting she deserved beautiful things just for the sake of having them. "Help me load these into your car," Linda asked, and I realized she'd bought enough plants to transform her entire front porch. "Planning to redecorate?" I asked as we carried the flowers to my trunk. "Planning to remember that I like having pretty things around me," she said. "It's easy to forget that when you're just focused on getting through each day." We found a bench in the small park adjacent to the market and sat down to eat our donuts and drink our cider. The morning was warming up, and there were families starting to arrive for what looked like soccer games on the nearby fields. Kids were running around with that particular weekend energy, and their parents were settling in with coffee and lawn chairs for a morning of cheering from the sidelines. "This is nice," Linda said, watching a little girl attempt to kick a soccer ball that was almost as big as she was. "I used to bring Jessica to games like this when she was younger. Some of my favorite memories are from Saturday mornings spent on sidelines, cheering for kids who were just happy to be running around outside. Do you miss that? Having someone to cheer for?" Linda thought about this while taking a sip of cider. "I miss having a built-in excuse to be part of community things like this. When you have kids, you automatically belong to this network of other parents, and there's always something to go to or someone to support. When your kids grow up, you have to be more intentional about staying connected." "Is that part of why you started coming to community center events?" "Partly. But also because I realized I was spending too much time alone in my house, feeling sorry for myself about things I couldn't change. Jessica pointed out that I could either keep doing that, or I could figure out how to build a social life that didn't revolve around being someone's wife or someone's mother." I nodded, understanding more about Linda's situation than I had before. "That must have been a difficult transition." It was, but it was also liberating in some ways. I got to rediscover what I actually enjoyed doing, rather than what I did, because it was expected or because someone else wanted me to do it. "Like line dancing?" Linda laughed. Line dancing was definitely not something I did for anyone else's benefit. That was pure self-indulgence. A soccer ball rolled toward our bench, and I stood up to kick it back to the little girl who'd been chasing it. She waved enthusiastically and ran back toward her game, pigtails bouncing. When I sat back down, Linda was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What?" I asked. "You're good with kids. I can see why you love teaching. Kids are easy. They're honest about what they think and feel, and they don't waste time on pretending to be something they're not." "Unlike adults?" "Unlike some adults," I said, looking at Linda. "Though I have to say, you're pretty honest yourself." "I've gotten more honest as I've gotten older," Linda said. "Life's too short to spend it trying to be what other people think you should be." We finished our breakfast and continued wandering through the market, eventually ending up at a booth selling handmade soaps and lotions. Linda was examining a bar of soap that smelled like lavender when her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, and her expression shifted slightly. "Everything okay?" I asked. "It's from my ex-husband," Linda said, putting the phone back in her purse without responding to the message. "He wants to have coffee next week to discuss something about Jessica's graduate school expenses." I wasn't sure how to respond to that. Linda's ex-husband was obviously part of her life in some capacity because of Jessica, but I didn't know what their relationship was like or whether his request for coffee was routine or unusual. "Is that something you do regularly?" I asked carefully. "Not really. We usually handle financial discussions over email or through Jessica. The fact that he wants to meet in person probably means he's planning to ask for something I'm not going to want to give him." Linda's tone suggested this wasn't a conversation she was looking forward to, and I found myself feeling protective in a way that was probably premature given how recently I'd met her. "Do you want to talk about it?" "Not particularly," Linda said, then seemed to reconsider. "Actually, maybe I do. Richard and I have been divorced for 3 years, but he still has this tendency to treat me like I'm being unreasonable whenever I don't immediately agree with his requests. Jessica's graduate program is expensive, and we both contribute to her tuition. But Richard has been hinting that I should cover more of the costs since he's supporting his new wife's kids from her previous marriage. That doesn't sound particularly fair." "It's not, but Richard has always been good at making financial arguments that sound reasonable on the surface, but are actually designed to benefit him at someone else's expense." I could hear the frustration in Linda's voice, and also something that sounded like resignation. "How do you usually handle these conversations?" "Poorly," Linda admitted with a wry smile. "I tend to get defensive and then agree to things I shouldn't agree to just to end the argument. It's a pattern I'm trying to break, but it's harder than it should be." "Maybe you should bring backup," I suggested, "or at least have someone you can call afterward to remind you that you don't have to solve all of Richard's financial problems." Linda looked at me with surprise. "You'd be willing to be my backup?" "If you want me to be. I don't know Richard, but I know you're not responsible for his new family's expenses, and I know you're capable of making your own decisions about what you can and can't afford." "Thank you," Linda said quietly. "I might actually take you up on that." We spent another hour at the market, eventually accumulating enough fresh vegetables to stock a small restaurant and several jars of honey from the local beekeeper who turned out to have strong opinions about the decline of native bee populations. By the time we loaded everything into my car, it was nearly noon and we were both starting to get hungry again. "Want to grab lunch somewhere?" I asked. "Or we could go back to your place and unload all these flowers first." "Let's do the flowers first," Linda said. "Then maybe we could make lunch together. I bought enough vegetables to feed a small army, and I'd like to hear more about your long-term career goals so I can report back to Jessica." Linda's kitchen was bright and welcoming, with windows that looked out onto a backyard garden that showed signs of careful tending. While Linda arranged her new mums on the front porch, I started washing the vegetables we'd bought, and when she came back inside, we fell into an easy rhythm of preparing lunch together. "So," Linda said as she sliced tomatoes for sandwiches, "tell me about these career goals Jessica thinks I should investigate." "Honestly, I'm not sure I have traditional career goals," I said. "I love teaching, and I can't imagine doing anything else as my day job. But I've been thinking about expanding the music programs at the community center, maybe starting some kind of music therapy initiative for seniors or kids with special needs." "That sounds wonderful. What would that look like?" I paused in my vegetable washing, realizing I'd never actually articulated these ideas to anyone before. I've been reading about how music can help with memory issues in dementia patients, and how it can be therapeutic for kids who struggle with traditional forms of communication. I keep thinking about ways to use music as a tool for connection and healing, not just entertainment. Linda stopped slicing and looked at me with genuine interest. "Have you talked to anyone about implementing something like that?" "Not really. It's still just an idea I've been playing around with. I'd need additional training, probably some kind of certification, and I'd have to convince the community center board that it was worth the investment." "But it's something you're passionate about?" "Yeah, it really is. There's something powerful about the way music can reach people when other forms of communication fail. I see it with some of my students who struggle academically but light up during music time. Linda resumed her tomato slicing, but I could tell she was thinking about what I'd said. You should pursue it, she said finally. The world needs more people who are willing to try innovative approaches to helping others. You think so? I do. And I think Jessica would approve of your career goals, assuming you can figure out the practical steps to make them happen. We carried our lunch out to Linda's back deck, which was furnished with comfortable outdoor furniture and had a view of her garden. It was the kind of space that suggested someone who valued quiet moments and appreciated the changing seasons. We ate in comfortable silence for a while, both of us seeming to enjoy the peaceful afternoon. Can I ask you something? Linda said eventually. Of course. What made you want to ask me to dinner after the mixer? I mean, really. Was it just because we had a nice conversation? Or was there something specific that made you think we might be compatible? I thought about how to answer that honestly. It was partly the conversation, but mostly it was watching how you interacted with other people throughout the evening. You were genuinely kind to everyone, even when Bob was stepping on your toes, during that dance. You made Margaret laugh, you were patient with the band when they were taking forever to set up, and you seemed to actually enjoy being there rather than just enduring it. Those seem like pretty basic social skills. You'd be surprised how uncommon they are. A lot of people, especially at social events, are so focused on making a good impression or networking or whatever, that they forget to just be present and enjoy themselves. You seemed comfortable with who you are and interested in other people for their own sake, not because of what they could do for you. Linda smiled, but it was a thoughtful expression. That's a very generous interpretation of my behavior. It's an accurate interpretation, and it made me want to spend more time with you, to see if that kindness and curiosity extended to one-on-one conversations. And what's your conclusion so far? That I was right to trust my instincts, I said. You're even more interesting in smaller doses. We spent the rest of the afternoon on Linda's deck, talking about everything from travel destinations we'd like to visit to books we'd read recently to her work as a physical therapist. Linda told me stories about helping patients regain mobility after accidents or surgeries, and I found myself impressed by her combination of technical knowledge and genuine empathy for people going through difficult recoveries. There's this woman I'm working with now, Linda said, who broke her hip in a fall last month. She's in her 70s, and she was convinced she'd never walk normally again. But she's been working so hard in our sessions, and yesterday, she walked the length of the parallel bars without any assistance. The look on her face when she realized what she'd accomplished, it was like watching someone discover they were capable of miracles. That must be incredibly rewarding work. It is. But it's also emotionally demanding sometimes. You get invested in people's recoveries, and when someone isn't making progress or when they give up on themselves, it's hard not to take it personally. How do you handle that? Linda considered the question while watching a cardinal land on her bird feeder. I remind myself that I can only control my part of the process. I can provide the best possible care and encouragement. But ultimately, people have to do the work themselves. It's taken me a long time to learn that lesson, and I still struggle with it sometimes. As the afternoon turned into early evening, I realized we'd been together for nearly 8 hours, and I hadn't once felt bored or restless or eager to be somewhere else. Spending time with Linda felt natural in a way that was both comfortable and exciting, like discovering a friendship that had the potential to become something deeper. I should probably head home soon, I said reluctantly. I have lesson plans to finish for Monday, and I imagine you have things to do to prepare for your week. Probably, Linda agreed, though she didn't sound any more eager to end the afternoon than I was. But this has been lovely. Thank you for spending your Saturday wandering around a farmer's market with me. Thank you for letting me. And for sharing lunch and your deck and your stories about difficult patients. As we gathered up our lunch dishes and Linda walked me to my car, I found myself thinking about the easy intimacy of the day. There had been something profoundly satisfying about doing ordinary things together, buying vegetables and making sandwiches and sitting in the sun talking about work and dreams and the complexities of adult relationships. David, Linda said, as we reached my car, I want you to know that today was exactly what I needed. Sometimes I forget how nice it is to have someone to share simple pleasures with. I feel the same way, I said. And I meant what I said about being backup for your coffee meeting with Richard. If you want someone to call afterward, or if you want to practice what you're going to say beforehand, I'm available. Linda stepped closer and gave me a hug that lasted longer than a casual goodbye, but wasn't quite a romantic embrace. It was something in between, an acknowledgement that we were becoming important to each other in ways that were still being defined. "I'll call you," she said softly. "And maybe next weekend we can try that hiking you mentioned. I'd love that." As I drove home, I found myself thinking about the layers of Linda's life that were gradually being revealed. She was dealing with an ex-husband who still tried to manipulate her decisions, raising a daughter who was protective but supportive, building a career that required both technical skill and emotional resilience, and somehow managing to approach new relationships with openness and honesty despite having been hurt before. The complexity of Linda's situation should have felt overwhelming, but instead, it felt like exactly the kind of challenge I was ready for. I was tired of dating people who hadn't lived enough life to know who they were or what they wanted. Linda knew herself, knew her values, and was clear about what she was looking for in a relationship. That clarity made everything else feel manageable. My phone buzzed with a text as I pulled into my apartment complex. "Thank you for a perfect Saturday. Looking forward to hiking adventures and whatever comes next." I replied immediately, "Thank you for letting me be part of your Saturday. Sweet dreams, Linda." As I settled in for the evening with my lesson plans and a cup of coffee, I realized I was already looking forward to Monday, not because I was excited about the school week, but because Linda had mentioned she might call to talk about her meeting with Richard. For the first time in a long time, I had someone in my life whose daily challenges I cared about, someone whose victories and struggles felt connected to my own happiness. It was both thrilling and slightly terrifying to realize how quickly Linda had become important to me. But as I thought about our afternoon together, the easy conversation and shared laughter and comfortable silences, I decided that some risks were worth taking. Linda was definitely worth taking a chance on. 3 months later, I found myself standing in the same community center where Linda and I had first met. But everything felt different now. The fall mixer had been replaced by a holiday celebration, complete with twinkling lights and the smell of cinnamon from the refreshment table. Linda was across the room, laughing with Margaret about something involving the volunteer schedule. And I caught myself smiling, just watching her animated gestures as she told whatever story had Margaret doubled over with laughter. Jessica appeared, beside me, carrying 2 cups of punch and wearing the expression of someone who had something important to say. Over the past few months, she'd evolved from suspicious interrogator to cautious ally, though she still maintained her role as Linda's protective daughter with admirable dedication. "She's different now," Jessica said without preamble, handing me one of the cups. "Happier. More like the mom I remember from before the divorce." "She's pretty amazing," I said, meaning it completely. "She is, and I owe you an apology for being so skeptical at the beginning. I thought you were either too young to understand what you were getting into, or you were going through some kind of quarter-life crisis and would disappear once the novelty wore off." I laughed. "Those were fair concerns. I probably would have been skeptical too if I were in your position. But you didn't disappear. And you've been there for her through some difficult stuff, like that whole mess with my father trying to manipulate her into paying more for my tuition." That conversation with Richard had been exactly as unpleasant as Linda had predicted, but she'd handled it with a strength and clarity that had impressed me. She'd listened to his arguments, asked pointed questions about his financial priorities, and ultimately told him that their existing agreement was fair and non-negotiable. When he'd tried his usual guilt tactics, she'd calmly ended the meeting and left him sitting in the coffee shop looking frustrated and confused. "Your mom is stronger than she gives herself credit for," I said to Jessica. "She just needed to remember that she doesn't have to justify her decisions to people who don't have her best interests at heart." "That's exactly what I mean," Jessica said. 6 months ago, she would have agreed to whatever he asked just to avoid conflict. Now she knows her own worth. The band started playing "The Way You Look Tonight," the same song Linda and I had danced to at the fall mixer, and I felt that familiar flutter of anticipation. Linda looked up from her conversation with Margaret and caught my eye across the room. smiling in a way that made everything else fade into background noise. "Go dance with her," Jessica said, giving me a gentle push. "And David? Thank you for making my mom remember that she deserves to be happy." I made my way across the room, dodging couples already swaying to the music and stepping around clusters of neighbors catching up on holiday plans. When I reached Linda, she was already extending her hand toward me like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. "I was hoping you'd ask," she said, as I led her onto the makeshift dance floor. "I was hoping you'd say yes," I replied, pulling her close enough to smell the familiar scent of her perfume mixed with the cinnamon and pine that filled the community center. We moved together with the easy familiarity we'd developed over months of practice, stolen moments at community events, and evening dance sessions in Linda's living room when Jessica was at her boyfriend's place. Dancing with Linda never got old because it wasn't really about the dancing anymore. It was about the quiet intimacy of moving together, the wordless communication that happened when two people were completely comfortable with each other. "So," Linda said softly, "Jessica tells me you've been accepted into that music therapy certification program." "I got the letter yesterday," I said, unable to keep the excitement out of my voice. "It starts in January, and I can do most of it online while still teaching. Margaret's already agreed to let me use the community center for practice sessions. I'm so proud of you for pursuing this. It's going to make such a difference in people's lives." "We'll see. I'm nervous about balancing everything, but I keep thinking about what you said about life being too short to spend it being what other people think you should be." Linda smiled, the expression that had first caught my attention months ago when she was laughing at her own line-dancing mistakes. "That's good advice. I should take it more often myself. You've been taking it plenty lately. Richard certainly discovered that you're not the pushover he thought you were." "That felt good," Linda admitted, standing up for myself instead of just trying to keep everyone else happy. The song began to wind down, but neither of us made any move to separate. Around us, other couples were swaying to the music, lost in their own conversations and connections. Margaret was dancing with Father Miguel, both of them moving with the practiced grace of people who'd been dancing together for decades. Carol from the flower shop was attempting to teach Bob some kind of complicated turn that he was executing, with more enthusiasm than accuracy. "Linda," I said, suddenly feeling like this moment required something more than casual conversation. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "That first night, when you asked if 48 was too old, what were you really asking?" Linda was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I think I was asking whether you were brave enough to take on someone whose life was already complicated, someone who came with history and responsibilities, and a daughter who would judge your worthiness as a potential stepfather figure. And now I think I was also asking whether I was brave enough to let someone young and optimistic and full of dreams into a life that felt pretty settled and predictable. What's your conclusion?" Linda stopped dancing and looked directly into my eyes, her expression serious, but not sad. "That age really is just a number, but courage isn't. It takes courage to risk caring about someone when you know that relationships can end badly. It takes courage to let someone see all your flaws and trust that they'll stick around anyway. And have you been feeling courageous lately?" "Very," Linda said, standing on her tiptoes to kiss me softly. "Especially when I'm with someone who makes me feel like the best version of myself." As the evening wound down and we helped clean up the community center, I found myself thinking about the question Linda had asked all those months ago. 48 wasn't too old for dancing, or for taking chances, or for building something new, with someone who appreciated both where she'd been and where she was going. Later, as we walked to our cars in the crisp December air, Linda slipped her hand into mine and squeezed gently. "David?" "Yeah?" "I'm glad you joked about taking me dancing, and I'm glad I was brave enough to ask if I was too old." "Best question anyone's ever asked me," I said, meaning it completely. As I watched Linda drive away, her taillights disappearing around the corner toward home, I realized that some of the best things in life happened when you stopped worrying about what was supposed to make sense and started paying attention to what actually made you happy. Linda made me happy, complications and all, and that seemed like the only thing that really mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.